Hello people of YouTube, Mishka Valhalla here. For those of you who have watched my previous video, it is about the goddess Freyja and the god Freyr, and sort of an introduction to the two of them. In this video, I'm going to specifically zero in on the goddess Freyja. I'm going to talk about her worship in the ancient world, and sort of how to apply that to the modern world and worship her in the modern world. Talk more about her lore and her characteristics as a goddess. Of course, we will get further in depth with Freyr in a future video, but this video is going to focus on Freyja. So without any further ado, let's talk about the Golden Goddess. So the goddess Freyja. For those of you who don't already know, Freyja is of course the twin sister to the god Freyr. And Freyr, of course, very much complements the goddess Freyja in a more masculine way, while Freyja, of course, symbolizes more of an earthy, feminine, fertility-based sort of essence. But when we are talking about the two gods, the twins of fertility, the twins of the Vanir, the son and daughter of Njord, they are both heavily focused on fertility, sexuality, abundance, prosperity. They are the Vanir. They, as I said in my last video, they are gods of peace, plenty, abundance, growing things, agriculture. Freyja is referred to by many names. One of her titles is, of course, Vanadis, which is like sort of a great goddess of the Vanir, or the Vanir weaver, or the weaver of the Vanir, sort of like a female ancestor that essentially has control over all others, and she sort of is a master weaver. She is known to practice and teach the rest of the gods the art of Seidr. And the art of Seidr is, of course, the act of weaving. It is the act of manifesting things into your life. Weaving is kind of like manifesting, but through a pagan lens. And what I mean by that is when we were talking about the Norns, and we are talking about the countless other goddesses in Norse lore, or even many other European lores or world lore, where people or women, these female entities, are weaving the fate of all things. You know, it isn't something that's assigned to one great all-powerful entity. This is something where many entities are working together to sort of create the outcome of existence, or sort of to manifest the things that happen all around us. When it comes to, say, the Freyja or Frigg or any of the Norse goddesses that practice the art, would be seen turning a wheel, or literally weaving, weaving a tapestry or something, an image that essentially creates an event, that is supposed to take place. And the Norns, the three sisters, who are Jotuns in origin, they are essentially in charge of a lot of the main events that occur. They are essentially situated at the roots of Yggdrasil in the underworld, where they weave the thread of fate around the Well of Erd, which means the well of the past. It is where all the things drip, all the things that happen drip down from the dew of Yggdrasil, and then they drop into the Well of Erd, which is essentially where all things flow, and it essentially feeds the roots of Yggdrasil. So it's essentially past memories, the waters of the past, sort of feeding and recycling through the tree of life, and then reoccurring. It's kind of like how events, keep repeating themselves throughout history. It's kind of like how Yggdrasil is constantly soaking up the dew of knowledge and then dropping it again to become water of the well of Erd, and then to essentially resurface again. But when we are talking about the wells in general, there are other wells like Mimir's well, which is the well of knowledge, which also feeds the tree of life. More particularly, a place where Odin, sacrificed his eye to acquire wisdom. And so essentially the roots of Yggdrasil are very much a sacred space where a lot of fate weaving occurs, where things are planned out. But the Norns aren't the only ones that weave. Like I said, Freyja is another one that weaves. Odin is another one that weaves, because Freyja taught Odin the art of Seidr. And I will talk more about Seidr since we are on the subject of Freyja, but I will not go too deep into, the concepts of weaving and the Disir and the ancestors that are in charge of fate. I will talk more about that in future videos, but when we are talking about Freyja, which means like the lady, I know that isn't entirely an accurate translation, but the idea of Freyja is that she is the matron, she is the matriarch. She represents sexuality, she represents fertility, she represents love, she represents death even. She is a death goddess. She is known to take those who fall in battle to Folkvanger. And she does, of course, have connections to other goddesses. She has a lot in common with other goddesses, and she could in fact be those other goddesses. Like Frigg, for instance. A lot of people assume that Freyja and Frigg are the same, when in reality they could and they couldn't. Because Frigg, in a way, has more of a mainland Germanic origin, while Freyja is very Scandinavian in origin. These matriarchies were around Sweden and Scandinavia well throughout until the Viking Age. And these matriarchies essentially were these orders that, more patriarchal societies like the Romans and the Greeks were trying to destroy. They were trying to slowly indoctrinate people into sort of going away from things that are more like feminine and mysterious and creative to things that are more structured and solidified and specific. Things are forced to be a certain way and to be perceived a certain way. That is essentially what brought down the matriarchies, was Rome's first subtle, advance towards the women in power, trying to just take them out of power and replace them with men, because a woman could not rule in a Greek or Roman society, not without a man to support them. So, this of course angered the Romans when they found out that the ancient Germanic and Norse and Celtic people were like praising women, and women were such a powerful part of the community. They did a lot of divination. Like I've mentioned in the past, the Norse had the vulvas, which were a bunch of, I guess you could say, shamanic priestesses or sorceresses who went around Scandinavia or mainland Germania, and they recited prophecies, and they weaved for people, they manifested for people, but they also were known to sort of practice this sort of healing, because they were tapping into these feminine energies of the earth. They were very nature-based, very shamanic, but in a way unique, because when we're talking about the vulvas, they're very much connected to the cult of Freyja. And Freyja is, like I said, this great earth goddess. She could in fact be the earth itself. In many ancient cults to Freyja, I am sure, almost certain, that certain groups would have seen Freyja as both the earth itself and a separate entity, that is the golden goddess, the goddess of peace and plenty, while she has her other form, which is the earth itself, the source of fertility. And I guess you could go further to say that Freyja could also be the same as Hela, because when you're going back, Freyja and Hela come from a much older figure known as Lady Frau Hol, which is sort of like this great underworld goddess, or this great earth goddess, who essentially provides for people and takes care of people, but essentially is this focus, sort of like this focus of power in the society, sort of like any other man who would rule the society. But when it came to these fertility cults, these feminine matriarchies, especially if we were talking about Sweden or Scandinavia, they were focused on essentially the crops, the land, praising the human body, sort of growing as individuals. But when it came to the cult of Freyja, it's very much about freedom and free will, especially when it comes to the feminine archetype. Because, when we're talking about entities like Frigg, kind of seems like a very Christian-influenced deity. But then again, the mainland Germanic people, where Frigg was mostly prominent, in those areas they had, of course, adopted more patriarchal and Abrahamic ways of thinking, because it was the pressure from the south. If your neighbors are the Romans or the Greeks, they're heavily patriarchal and they don't respect you because you have a woman in charge while everybody else in the south has a man. And when it comes to sort of their influence on the society, there tends to be sort of a different vibe for it, a different focus. For a lot of the matriarchies, it was a lot about, sort of like embracing, the earth, embracing your imperfections, while also focusing on the things that do make you beautiful, focusing on, the things that help a society. But of course, that can still be applied in a way to a patriarchy, where a male rules, a society, but of course it depends on the individual. But when we are talking about the majority, of course, or like common cases, the matriarchies were often heavily associated with more earthy, more free-thinking ways of order, while patriarchal groups were more focused on the conquest and the war aspect, and sort of the structure of things, keeping things a certain way, making people think a certain way, and sort of having this status quo that everybody has to abide by. While as, let's say a cult of Freyja, or a society that honors a matriarch, who essentially is like a priestess or a vulva who honors Freyja, it is obviously a focus that is more around, the structure. Like, it focuses on the things around the structure. It focuses on the elements. It focuses on the earth itself. It focuses on the different things that essentially, add it color and vibrant. But of course, you couldn't say that it was all madness. There wasn't just a bunch of people trying to, dismantle the matriarchies, because in fact, if we're talking about ancient Germanic and Norse society, they themselves practiced forms of equal rulership, meaning like you had the male shamanic figure, or sort of like this Gothi or chieftain figure, that is very well versed in their traditions and, I guess you could say, folk magic, while the woman is also the lead matriarch, a lead patriarch and a lead matriarch, and they work together on equal playing fields. The matriarch essentially serves as like that vulva entity, sort of like this woman that focuses on healing and herbs and the more creative side of society, creating sort of the images, the colors, the flavors around, what is essentially the structure that the patriarch is trying to hold and maintain. So essentially they're working together to both add something useful to the society. But of course, that didn't last with the Christian conversions of Europe, because then you started to have women slowly lose their power and being forced in a more docile, domestic type of way. A lot of women naturally wanted to be in the home so they could take care of the children, so they could cook the food. But if we were talking about pagan society, or like more particularly a Norse society, the woman was the woman of the household. There was no man of the house. It was the woman who owned the house. So she had the keys to the house. And it's a lot like, that's when the goddess Frigg does come in, is she's depicted with keys on her apron, because it's like she owns the keys to the house and she can kick the man out if she wants. But of course, this was, like I said, something gradual. So when it came to like the Viking Age, which was like 900s to 1000s, 12,000s AD, the women were typically, they were lesser than men. They could not speak in, public gatherings. Like, they couldn't lead like a public gathering or a speech or whatever, but they could still play a role in healing and in doing magic and savor. But they were sort of just shoved to the side, just like, you are the house now, and that is where you have to stay because you are property like the house is. But going further back, the woman is in the house, but she owns the house. It is hers because she's always there. But then again, you have, and obviously she takes care of everything, but then you have, of course, the women that wanted to go out and go to battle, who became essentially what we know as field maidens, which I'm definitely a firm believer in because there is archaeological evidence of it, of women buried with weapons and tools and strategic devices. I'm pretty sure there was a woman buried with Schneffeltafel, which is a board game, very strategic, and including her weapons and armor. But when we were talking about these burials, some people will be like, no, just because they're buried with their weapons doesn't mean it was theirs. Yes it did, because the idea of being buried with stuff is so that they can go with you to the afterlife. They are attached to you. They are a part of your soul. If we are going to go from the typical pagan understanding when it comes to animistic awareness and the physical reality and the important objects, like let's say an ancient Norseman or woman would have with them, they would have that, and most of the time they'd even have a name for it. You look at the gods, the Norse gods, they have names for all their shit. They all have meaning because it's animism. Everything is alive. Everything has its own expression of consciousness. Sorry, I'm going really deep in this video, even though it is just about Freyja. But all these things apply to her because the figure of Freyja is, of course, a very strong one, and her worship lasted much longer than Odin's because there was plenty of women still trying to maintain their power, to stay strong in society, while their rights were gradually taken away. It was just kind of like, where else are we going to go other than to worship our freeing feminine sexual goddess, or are we just going to stay at home all day and just be scolded by our husbands? The cult of Freyja lasted much longer, but it was, of course, it still took all the other gods being transformed into, more Christian-like archetypes, like Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda. They describe the gods as being, very, dumb and just, I don't know. They're just definitely not taken seriously, and their nature is changed, from the way they act in the Poetic Edda, which was more archaic and ancient, and it, has this interesting animistic, deeper knowledge to it, this poetic knowledge, hence the Poetic Edda. But then you've got the Prose Edda, which is more heavily influenced by Christian propaganda. Things are told in a more storybook format rather than a more metaphorical, symbolic format, like a more pagan mythology would be read. But of course, you can't really expect that reading the Prose Edda. But anyway, before I talk that subject more to death, I will make a separate video about, the matriarchies of Sweden and sort of the vulvas, of course. I will definitely make a video about vulvas, to sort of talk more about Seidr. Seidr is, like I said, what the goddess Freyja created and taught to the rest of the gods. Sort of this feminine, earthy magic that could have, of course, involved sexual magic, especially since Freyja is a goddess of sexuality, sort of these ancient, archaic forms of sexual transformation. Obviously not for everybody, but that's why not everybody worshipped Freyja. And then, of course, you had other forms such as, I guess, what some would call astral projection. But when it came to Seidr, it was something more earthy, not necessarily something that a vulva needed to be unconscious for, like a whole body full unconsciousness. They would be able to essentially send a part of themselves, out, as a messenger, or to retrieve something in the spiritual realm, like power or advice. There's like these parts of the self that I do talk about in my other videos. Here's a link to the parts of the self video. I will talk more about it. But when we were talking about the parts of the self, as far as Seder, essentially the vulva is sending parts of herself out, to interact with the spiritual world. So essentially you have many layers of your soul, and each part has a different role that plays, and essentially adds up to who you are as an entity. But of course I will talk more, like I said, about that in future videos. Please check out the one I linked. But Freyja, when we are talking about the goddess herself, in ancient times, her worship, obviously we can't say exactly how certain gods were worshipped, obviously, or any of them, but we can of course look at the evidence that we have and the written sources of how they did it, and how they could have done it. But essentially here in this modern world, we Norse pagans, like myself, do our best to, a lot of us anyway, we do our best to look at the sources and the archaeology, and to do our best to sort of find the parallels and to understand sort of this kind of universal pagan understanding when it comes to like how we approach the divine or see the divine in the world around us and how we interact with it. But if we were talking about Freyja, which this video is focused on, Freyja is a goddess of love. She's a goddess of fertility, a goddess of death, war, riches, abundance, all those good things. I mean, death and war obviously is something that, a lot of people can't really stomach, which is understandable, especially since, a goddess being focused in love also represents war, and certain people cannot understand how that mixes. But when we are talking about the Norse gods or pagan gods, they, of course, yes, they represent the things in life that are good, but they also have a balance. They aren't these all-knowing, perfect entities, like there is, in fact, in the pagan way of understanding, there is no such thing as a perfect entity. Not even Balder, because, well, he clearly died, so he's not perfect, and Loki, one of his roles was to prove that Balder wasn't perfect, but that, of course, I will make videos about Balder and Loki and explain the meaning and symbolism behind that, and of course the popular theories we have as far as Balder's death. But when we are talking about Freyja and honoring her, life and death, is sort of something that's just a part of existing. Like to the ancient people, death happened so often that it was just viewed as something normal, just like, oh, grandpa died, I'm sad, but I will still worship his spirit and I will still talk to him, because to the ancient people, death wasn't the end. Far from it. They were animists. They had an attachment to their sword, they had an attachment to their house, they had an attachment to their pets, and therefore, of course, they would still have a relationship with those who have died, those who have been closest to them, those that they love. They revere them as still being around, as being actual spiritual entities that care about your well-being. And then again, some might argue, then why isn't the world perfect? Why aren't we all living perfect lives where the dead can just take care of us? Well, they're dead. Their job is not to make our lives longer. They're there to make our lives better, it's not about, I'm gonna live to 90, and I'll feel complete, I'll have retirement money and I'll die happy. Chances are this person didn't even travel the whole world, they didn't visit every town in their state, and they probably didn't experience any sort of dreams of theirs coming true. But then again, that is, of course, when your own effort comes into play. That is something that a lot of pagans will stress, and it's that the gods will not care about your goals and motivations unless you actually make a step yourself in making them possible. Once you start caring about your own power and focusing on that and being relentless about it, the gods care. I mean, the point is to not be a jerk, and to not ruin, the closest thing that the Norse could consider karma or log, to break ties with people, to destroy connections, that don't need to be destroyed, to betray people especially. Betrayal was something that was huge to the ancient people. If you betrayed your family, you're betraying yourself. So that's like an ultimate, what they would call sin, because sin as a concept isn't really something that existed in paganism. There were deeds that you shouldn't do, like stealing, murdering, and just, being a straight up coward about it and hiding it. Like there's just layer upon layer of bad things you could do that are literally bad. But it takes a whole list of rules for someone to feel content and like they're actually following a good religion, which is a little sad to me. But anyway, I'm getting off track. I went on a little tangent there. But with Freyja, as far as worshiping her, it is very good to go in places of nature, obviously, sort of embrace, your feminine side. Go look for things that are sweet and decadent, but essentially things that really stimulate you, things that just make you feel more alive. That's what Freyja represents. She represents a lot of things that essentially are wholesome and plentiful. Like if you're a farmer, that's a perfect time to worship Freyja. And, or if you're a caregiver, if you're someone who helps breed animals or help, people in hospitals have babies, that's a perfect thing to do, to honor Freyja. To leave her gifts, to make her an altar, to make an image for her and a bowl where you can give her any little trinkets or food or offerings, and maybe a cup where you can pour her drinks. Just give her a little spot that's dedicated to her, or just have this whole area in like a backyard, or if you have a bunch of land and you're lucky enough, then dedicate a plot of land to her, or all the gods for that matter. It's good to have a place where you can go. I love to go just anywhere outside to honor the gods, or any god I'm, trying to reach out to, or entity. But it's going to be different for everybody. Some people will need an altar and some people will not. But of course I will talk more about personal worship and practice in future videos. I did make a video about constructing an altar, but I think I will make better future videos. But here's a link to that video. And now, with any further ado, we are going to talk about a few of the stories about Freyja. So many of you may know about the story of Brasingamen, where Freyja sought her magical golden necklace. She wanted to find a magical jewel that the dwarves could forge for her. And of course the dwarves have been known to forge the weapons of all the gods. The dwarves are heavily connected to, I guess you could say, that earthy, feminine energy. They are all about creativity, creating things. They are a little chaotic in nature, obviously, as earth entities and sort of elemental. But they essentially were assigned a task to make the golden necklace for Freyja. But this was when Freyja was wed to the god Odr, which means ecstasy. So Odr could literally be Odin, but it could also be just an aspect of Odin. Some think that it's a separate entity entirely, but I don't think so. But and the reason I say that is because Odin, technically means of fury or made of fury, while Odr is fury or ecstasy. So Freyja, she essentially craves ecstasy. She craves that spiritual ecstasy, while also craving these magical jewels that the dwarves forged for her. So she goes, essentially to the home of the dwarves and wants a golden necklace, but she has to sleep with all 4 of them and marry them in order to have it. So she does it. this doesn't seem like a difficult task for Freyja, because she is very sexually open. She very much embraces herself and her own desires and what she wants. But she isn't necessarily, a trickster like Loki, but she does in the stories tend to still give in to her nature, which is something that is very earthy, something that is very free-flowing, and something that doesn't really care about, rules or bounds of how somebody should express themselves sexually or physically. And that's what's very powerful about the goddess Freyja, is because she's very much a goddess that empowers the feminine energy and tells it to do whatever the fuck it wants. But when we were talking about her golden necklace, she lusted after that necklace. She wanted that necklace so bad, and when she got it, she came back to her home to see her husband gone and went off wandering because apparently he was displeased. This could be Odin, or it could be ecstasy. It could be raw ecstasy, the raw inspiration, this raw spiritual inspiration. The goddess Freyja had 2 daughters, one of which was named Hnoss, which means jewel, and Gemesi, which means treasure. Further clarifying how much Freyja was associated with riches and abundance and a sort of the things in society that people acquired in order to trade and to keep things stable. Freyja is, of course, represented by the cat, because the cats, of course, pull her chariot. And oftentimes in ancient Scandinavia, people would use body parts of cats and felines for magic that was focused on fertility or the worship of Freyja, sort of like to make charms or, to, of course, cast spells. And of course, people kept cats to honor Freyja and took care of them and fed them. Kind of like how in Folkvanger, it is where many cats go when they die. It is believed that after the cat has lived 9 lives, 9 being a very important number, after their 9th life, they go and live with Freyja. Folkvanger is Freyja's home. It means the field of the host. It is, of course, the field where many slain warriors and lovers go when they die. The idea is that Freyja gets the first half of the slain when the battle is over, so she comes through and takes fallen warriors to Folkvanger, while Odin will come after with his Valkyries, and they will choose the slain for him to go to Valhalla. Freyja is also associated with falcons and birds of prey, for she's well known to have her cloak of falcon feathers, or feathers in general, where she can use it to shapeshift and to turn into various birds and to fly about. Frigga, of course, has the same thing, which could make some people think that they are indeed the same entity, but of course you could also look at it as a fact of just being a cultural trait, because just like any other animistic society, they are known to carry the skin of animals they are wanting to take on the power of or to shapeshift into. And the idea of shapeshifting to the ancient people, could have had more to do with astral travel and Seidr and the parts of the self, and sort of surrounding yourselves with the things that are associated with that animal and putting yourself in a mental state where you can essentially put yourself in the perspective of the animal or to achieve some sort of spiritual task by becoming that animal in the spiritual realm. But of course, I will talk more about that at Seidr and sort of the idea of hammer, or to change one's hammer, which in Old Norse means one's appearance. To change your appearance, or to be a hammer, is like a shapeshifter. But of course, the way that's understood, is obviously not the same way as it's understood when somebody watches like some sort of fantasy movie where someone literally just turns into an animal, like physically just turns into an animal. As far as I'm concerned, I guess it could happen, but there's not really proof for it, right now. But if we're talking about shapeshifting from the way we can understand it, through the sagas is that it was more of something that was spiritual and mental, sort of like how people like berserkers and Ulfathin would invoke the spirit of a bear or a wolf, sort of their animal spirit, and then they would be possessed by that spirit, and then they would become that spirit, and they would essentially go to battle. But that is sort of the same thing. But Hamar wasn't always the same, obviously, as a berserker or an Ulfathin or Ulfednar. Anyway, I think I have talked about Freyja for quite some time now and the things surrounding her. I will touch more up on her and revisit her in future videos, especially when I'm mentioning her in her association with other deities. She is a goddess that I highly respect and honor myself in my own personal practice. So for any of you who are interested in worshiping Freyja, I would highly recommend it. But other than that, that is my video on Freyja. Please like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching. Please stay tuned for future videos, and please take care of all of your loved ones. The virus is still going on, and things are changing all around us. So please stay safe. Hail the gods, hail your ancestors, and hail the spirits. Peace on earth, everybody. Skull.